New research argues that opportunities for public comment are shrinking on both sides of the Atlantic as governments move faster and give people less time to respond. Those shortcuts may seem efficient, but they come with real risks for transparency and the quality of policymaking. Stephen Balla, co-director of the Regulatory Studies Center at George Washington University, is here to explain the pros and cons. Professor Balla, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Your recent research argues that both the U.S. and the EU are cutting back on opportunities for public comment in the regulatory space. So for those of us who are kind of federal regulatory nerds, why is that important?
Well, public commenting is one of the key principles of good governance and regulatory policymaking, along with regulatory impact analysis, benefit cost analysis. So analyzing the benefits and costs of regulations, and then also asking the public what it thinks. And so given that public commenting is one of the key core principles of regulatory policymaking, any efforts to erode its prevalence in the process is something to take note of.
Let's take the EU first and kind of dive into what's happening there. They've got new expedited procedures as one example. How is that working?
Well, it's really interesting in that public commenting is a much more recent phenomenon in the EU than here in the United States, where we've been doing it for close to a century. And so I find it particularly noteworthy that just 10 years after rolling out new public comment requirements for policymaking, the European Commission is now in the process, apparently, of dialing some of those back. And what's interesting is over the past 10 years, they've developed a public comment regime that we might think is even more robust than in the United States, in that over the course of a policymaking process, stakeholders may have as many as 4 opportunities to offer feedback to what's happening. But those are now being rolled back in the interest of expediting policymaking, dealing with crises, those sorts of imperatives that governments around the world are facing today.
Are the European citizens rising up and complaining about a loss of opportunity?
If I had to guess, I would argue, and this would be true on both sides of the Atlantic, that most citizens have no idea this is happening. And I think this is one reason why a conversation like this is important.
Well, let's talk about what's happening on the U.S. side then. The Trump administration is using the Administrative Procedures Act's good cause exception to get after some of those same goals: efficiency, speed, timeliness. How's that going?
Yeah, it's really interesting in that the governments on both sides of the Atlantic are quite different in their policy objectives. But nevertheless, both sets of governments are really interested in economic performance, affordability, all of these bread and butter issues. And so they find these procedures, these good governance principles, to be in the way of quick achievement of those aims. And so in the U.S. context, the Trump administration has a deregulatory agenda. It's made no secret about that. That's one of its main objectives. And it sees these procedures as getting in the way. And so as a result is interested in using this legal maneuver, the good cause exception in the Administrative Procedure Act, to avoid public comment when it's rescinding existing regulations.
How do you balance the tension between deliberation and inclusion with speed? Our system is designed to be slow on purpose.
You've hit the tension. You hit the nail on the head with that tension, and that's the core issue, I think, at play here, which is, on the one hand, in a democracy, we want the people's voices to be heard. We want stakeholders to have an opportunity to provide information to policymakers. On the other hand, economic competitiveness, speed in policymaking, especially in times that are changing and uncertain, is really important. So I don't want to suggest that dialing back public commenting processes are necessarily problematic. It's just that we'd like to think carefully about why we're doing it. Be aware of that tension that you've raised. And what I'm afraid of on both sides of the Atlantic is that policymakers are in a rush to change without really conceiving of what some of the unintended consequences of these changes might be. And we could talk about some of those unintended consequences.
We'll do that in just a minute. I'm speaking with Stephen Balla. He's co-director of the Regulatory Studies Center at GW. Now let's come back to some of those policy choices. How are they playing out?
Well, for sure, they're allowing both the Trump administration here in the U.S. and the European Commission to make policy changes at a quite rapid rate, at a much more rapid rate than we're used to seeing in advanced industrialized democracies, right? You talked earlier about the fact that the policymaking process is designed to be deliberate, some might say slow, but we're seeing quite rapid change in a lot of these areas. And so removing these public comment processes has real implications for the speed of policy change and then by extension, the actual substance of policy that's emerging from governments on both sides of the Atlantic.
What role is technology playing in speeding up this process?
Well, what's interesting is that we thought that technology was going to really bog down the public comment process in that it would be really easy for advocacy groups to send in large numbers, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of comments to government agencies, and that would slow down the process. Or that technology might make it easier for bad actors to use bots and other elements to spam the comment process. We haven't seen, other than a few notable examples, we haven't seen that yet on a large scale. And so what's interesting in that is that the technological developments of recent years haven't fundamentally changed the dynamics of the public comment process.
You mentioned, and I have to agree with you, I think we have to be honest, that there's really only a tiny sliver of the population that plays this game anyway. Is there an argument that says actually speed is better because it limits the number of people that can be involved? Only those who are passionately interested in the topic at hand are going to respond. It's better if we keep that quick and short.
There's an argument to be made there. I'll push back a little bit in that I think part of the public comment process is for the so-called insiders, right? The Beltway bandits, if you will, to use a pejorative term. Part of it is for the stakeholders. Maybe that's a nicer way to say it, for the stakeholders to bring new information into the process that agencies might not be aware of or might not be aware of how important it is to stakeholders. But we have to think that the policymaking process is not just a legal administrative process. It's also occurring inside a democratic political system. And so I think it's a legitimate goal of the public comment process for it to reach out to a broader public. So for mass membership groups to encourage their members to send large numbers of comments to agencies, which does happen on occasion. And so the public comment process is an interesting hybrid, I think, of both technical, legal, economic information on the one hand that's held by a small number of specialists and insiders. But on the other hand, it's part of democratic policymaking, and all players are welcome in that sense.
Let's go back to the EU for a minute, because you mentioned up front that there have been as many as 4 opportunities for folks to participate and comment on particular regulations. Is that process holding up? Are they getting the kind of participation that they want, or how are they changing that?
So I think some of the early returns on the EU's innovations in public commenting are pretty positive. And that's why it's surprising that there's such a quick move to scale those back or walk away from some of them. I do think there's been some really good reviews, good analysis that suggests new information is being brought. And this is important in the EU context because the European Commission naturally suffers from a democracy deficit, if you will, because it's a supranatural policymaking entity, very different from what we're talking about here in the United States.
Well, then coming back to the United States, thinking about our system and the arguments this administration has made for moving faster, are there some reforms that you would want to see put on the table that could make it more responsive, be open to the public, and still kind of address the need for the regulatory process to move as fast as the situation might require?
One of the reforms I'm interested in, and it's been around Capitol Hill for years now, is to have public commenting at an earlier stage of regulatory policymaking. One of the issues with commenting as it's currently constituted is that it occurs at a relatively late stage of the process. Agencies have already spent maybe years developing their proposal. Positions have hardened. And that leads to a lot of legal tussling over agency rules. I personally would like to see much earlier public engagement at a point where agencies are still scoping out initial ideas. They might be more receptive to public input. And even this might sound counterintuitive. I think earlier participation could have the effect of, in the overall scheme of things, expediting the development of policy, because we don't have these later in the process delays that might be associated with knockdown, drag 'em out fights in later public commenting as it's now constituted.
Are you sensing any movement in that direction?
Well, unfortunately, in today's environment on Capitol Hill, everything gets sucked into a polarization vortex. And so if one party emerges as the champion of a particular reform, and in the case of earlier public commenting, it tends to be Republicans who are in favor of that, that then has the boomerang effect of many Democrats see it as an inherently anti-regulatory reform, which I don't necessarily share that sense of how it would operate in practice. I think it's a procedurally neutral reform that both the left and the right could use to their benefit when they hold the levers of government in their hands.
It sounds like we need some participative governance on that topic.
Absolutely.
I've been speaking with Stephen Balla. He's co-director of the Regulatory Studies Center at the George Washington University. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.